Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing in Education Podcast, the space where education meets resilience. I'm Dr. Joey Weisler, and in each episode, we dive deep into the personal stories of educators, students, leaders, and frontline advocates who are navigating the complexities within modern education. Whether you're just starting your teaching journey or are a seasoned professional looking for inspiration, we'll explore how to foster meaningful change, prevent burnout, and build trauma-informed communities within our schools. Now, let's take a seat at the front of the classroom as we get started. Welcome back to the Classroom Narratives Podcast, where today's guest is somebody who has helped reframe how many of us think about education, not just in terms of how we teach, but also why we teach, and how schools can evolve to support the whole human being. Rob Macleod is a Canadian-raised educator who has also taught internationally in Germany and in Belgium, and he's also a coach and the co-host of the Reinventing Education Podcast, which is a platform used to understand how schools work with those who run them. And Rob is here today to bring some deep insight into how systems think, talk about integral theory, as well as school culture, and topics that are urgently having us transform the way that we see education. So Rob, thank you so much for being here all the way from Belgium. It is such our privilege, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joey. I'm very glad to be here.
It's such a delight because I'm just so fascinated by the work that you do, and I know that our guests will feel the same. So I wanted to begin just by thinking about what you are doing within education currently. What inspired you to go into this field and do so through such a global sense in both North America and in Europe? And what's your background to that, as in addition to some of the current roles that you have?
So what got me interested was I'm someone who was very lucky to have had a fantastic primary school experience. So from kindergarten to grade 8, I was in a absolutely fantastic, high functioning public school in rural Canada. And I had some very influential teachers that really, to this day, have left a mark on me in a very positive way. My high school years, for a variety of reasons, were less desirable. I was less academically successful, struggled more socially, struggled with some of the mental, emotional transitions of that life phase. And then I'm someone who absolutely crushed it in post-secondary when I finally got to university.
Nice.
And when I look back on it, there were some really influential people who helped me through the good and through the bad times. And I guess there was like a part of me that wanted to pay that back in some way or to be that for someone else, alongside several other interests connected to education. I started in Ontario, started teaching at a time where it was really difficult to be a new teacher. After 3 years of being very lucky to have work as a new teacher, I thought, I'm going to go teach internationally for just 2 years. I'll come back and we'll see if it's a little bit easier to keep work in schools. Those 2 years turned into 11, going on 12 years now, 5 years in Frankfurt, Germany, and 5 years in Belgium, with a little brief return to Canada in the middle there before settling down long term now in Belgium. So, most recently, my biggest role in schools was head of a middle school, and I've really enjoyed being in a variety of different educational contexts because as soon as you change countries, you really notice that a lot of the assumptions about what education should or shouldn't be get challenged. It just really opened my eyes to the huge diversity of values behind different education systems, and at the same time, patterns that seemed to be present across all of the systems that I was coming in contact with, and now I can't ignore it. As far as my current role, I guess you could say I'm in a sabbatical year where I'm just finishing up my first book, which has been a wonderful and humbling experience to share some of those ideas that I was just alluding to in a book that I hope to have released this summer.
Excellent. We can't wait to hear about your upcoming text as well. And something that's grabbed my attention is that I wanted to hear about some of the competing value systems and patterns that you've explored. And as a leader, how do you acknowledge that and share it among those who work alongside you as well?
So, what became very apparent to me was when we ask people, what does a good education look like? I noticed that there are three very distinct paths that answers started to take. And with time, I kind of alongside the work of Brendan on our podcast, Brendan O'Leary, we started to really shape out what these three paths look like in terms of three paths that a school can go on in terms of its development. And we gave three terms: expert, coach, and counselor. And these three represent three very different roles that the school and its staff can take for its students or for their students. So if you're an educator, ask yourself, how do you want the decisions about teaching and learning in your classroom to be decided? And to me, there are three different ways that the teaching and learning decisions in your classroom can be decided. And they are either through autonomy, through collaboration, or through negotiation. So the expert school, the head of school decides for the staff below them. And in the classroom, the teacher, being the head of the pyramid in their classroom, makes the decisions for their students. So they can use their professional discernment to custom tailor what they're doing to the students in their classroom. So they are using autonomy to make the decisions for the teaching and learning in their classroom. Now, of course, there will still be board regulations and the state's standards, but they have the autonomy to carry out those things as they see best fit. Now, if we move on to the coach, there's still very much a hierarchy, but now it's layered. We've given up some autonomy. We don't have the final say on what we're doing because we have to uphold this shared school-wide approach to teaching and learning. But we see it, or we believe it to be, more effective and more efficient than if we were all working with autonomy. And so those coach teachers, they're using collaboration across the staff to inform what the teaching and learning looks like in their room. And then finally, if we move to the counselor approach, we've flattened the hierarchy. So we've gone from a clear hierarchy to a layered hierarchy, and now a flattened hierarchy, where anyone, student, staff, even parents, can influence the direction of a school and can influence the direction of the teaching and learning.
There's a fourth branch that you've mentioned as well in our prior conversations, which is called the facilitator. And I know a lot of our educators also may identify with that. Like, even when I walk into a classroom, I will say to my own college students, I am your course facilitator. And without even really understanding what that meant, that was already by default how I identify myself. And then when I heard you talk about it on Reinventing Education, like, oh yeah, no, that's right. That's who I am. And that's what I am. Can you tell us more about that model as well?
So this is a little bit like a surprise ending where I keep talking about the three types of school, the three: expert, coach, and counselor, and the
Yeah.
three. And then near the end of the conversation, and as it happens in my book, in the final section of the book, I say, actually, I would argue that there's a fourth
Yeah.
emerging
The
approach,
addendum.
the facilitator. So the facilitator is interesting because it's almost like it contradicts what I've already told you today, Joey. So I'm saying that in our heart and mind and in our practice, we tend to lean towards one of these three more than the others. I would argue that there is a fourth approach, and it's the facilitator. And I guess before I go into more detail about it, what I often say about the three types is you're better off choosing one of the three types, expert, coach, and counselor, and doing it well, than you are to be caught in a tug of war between types, an unintentional tug of war. Because if you've worked in schools probably more than 4 years, you've probably seen a school move in one direction, abandon it, and then move in the opposite direction, and then abandon that and move in another direction. And sometimes it's influenced by the authorities above you. Sometimes it's just a change in who's the principal or leadership. But schools have this habit of drifting in a tug of war back and forth between types. And this is why I thought addressing these three types was so important, because we lose so much time, energy, resources, and personal investment. Educators get jaded after a few years or go, oh, we're going back to the thing you told us there was research saying we shouldn't be doing anymore 5 years ago. So choose one of these three types. Do it well is the best advice.
So it sounds like instead of systems that work in isolation between the counselor, coach, and expert schools, these are more like paradigms that coexist within education.
Yes. And I've only ever seen a blend. And I think that's why this has been so helpful for so many people. It put words to something that most of us inherently felt and kind of knew, but couldn't quite say. I likened it the other day to having only ever tasted the three flavors in a cocktail. We've only ever experienced them as mixed together.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually sit down and say, oh no, it's actually three different ingredients. It's orange juice,
Right.
it's seltzer, and it's whatever, lime or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you notice how they're actually completely different things?
Mm-hmm.
But you've had a more lime flavored one, or one that had too much seltzer, or one that had too much orange juice.
Yeah.
So they are things that are happening alongside each other. And for the most part, from what I've seen, the misalignment is what's at the core of a lot of unspoken challenges in schools. And to put it into a more positive sense, I'm not pretending that every school is in peril and in some horrible tug of war between these three. When you look at the schools that are crushing it and doing really well and really healthy expressions and places people want to be, students and staff want to be in these schools, when I see it just as a matter of alignment. It's this place got clear on which of the three they are, even without these words. Through trial and error, you are able to articulate and get clear what values, what are non negotiables, and you pursue them to their fullest. So when I see the schools that are doing really well, where people really enjoy being, I see alignment. When I see the schools that are dysfunctional, and the schools where people are apathetic and not caring and feeling like I'm doing all this work and it's not contributing meaningfully, what I see there is misalignment.
And I'm sure having the alignment in place can really help with instances such as classroom discipline or management culture as well.
Oh, of course. Yeah. If you are being asked to do practices that you personally and professionally disagree with, that's not sustainable. But
Right.
if you're being asked to carry out practices that you do personally and professionally agree with, it's leaning you much more towards like a flow state, that alignment, things functioning well, than the opposite.
Right. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about your authorial works as well, such as your text and your own podcast as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, gladly. So the ideas that I've been sharing with you today, the 3 or 4 types of school, that's the main idea of the book. I also discuss this idea of the 4 dimensions of a school. And similar to the story of the 4 blind men that are touching an elephant,
Yes.
and the one at the trunk saying an elephant is like a snake, and the one at the leg is saying it's like a tree trunk, and the one at the body is saying it's like a wall, and the one at the ear is saying no, it's delicate and thin like paper. That's what an elephant is. Often in schools, we focus on one of the 4 dimensions more than the others. And those 4 dimensions are organizational, relational, actionable, and personal. And I won't now get into a giant explanation or articulation of the ins and outs of all those 4, but it's another really important tool, because if you are someone who cares and wants to contribute meaningfully in schools, you're going to have to navigate all 4 of those. And typically, as educators, we do one really well, we do 2 of them okay, and there's one that's our blind spot, or the spot where most of our challenges emerge. So it's another tool, the 4 dimensions, alongside the 3 types, to give educators who really want to contribute meaningfully the capacity to do so. And I guess, in short, what my book is really about is, I think all of us know educators who got into schools wanting to make a difference and showed up full of a lot of passion, and then lost it to some degree along the way. And there's a strong start, and then at some point there's a giant hiccup in the road. And some of that is just our naive ideas getting burnt off and separating fairy
Yes.
tales from reality, for sure.
Yes. Yep.
But typically, there's another layer of it, which gets into this idea of alignment or misalignment. And what I hope that the book does is gives people the tools to be able to name which of these 3 environments they thrive in, and give them tools like the 4 dimensions then to pursue doing that type well, and helping educators who are somewhere between frustrated to disillusioned to burnt out to prepared to leave education completely, to give them pause for a moment, maybe reframe the misalignment or struggles that they've been feeling, and help them to reclaim which of these ways do they feel they contribute meaningfully in schools, and give them the tools to move on that path as opposed to a path towards the disillusionment, the not caring. And this is where the title of my book came in, which I'll give you the PG version, which is Schools That Give an F. And I didn't choose this title as like a clickbaity, get your attention title with a swear word in it. I used it because I've had conversations with hundreds of passionate educators. And the phrase that has come up the most when talking with them in private, away from professional contexts, is the idea of passionate educators being terrified of schools that don't give an F, places where people have checked out and the people don't give an F. And so that was the way that I wanted to frame this book is, if that's our nightmare, if that's what we want to stay away from, how do we build its opposite? How do we create schools that do give an F, where people are contributing meaningfully? And to me, that first step was to separate these three paths you can go on to get there and to know which path you should be on. So that's the book. Very excited for it. It's a combination of these tools along with some stories and a lot of very practical things to turn all this theory into actionable things you can do in your classroom or in your school, in your next interview even. And yeah, the work that I'm doing with Brendan, that's been the engine that has supported this book. I say, I'm the one who sat down and typed these words into the Word document to make the book. But these ideas have come through the work of Brendan O'Leary and I on our podcast over the last 6 years, where we've just teased apart in great detail the subtle differences between these three types. And along the way, we've been able to have conversations with inspiring educators, including yourself, Joey, where we want to talk to people who do care, who do give an F, and are contributing in meaningful ways in education.
And we'll also see a link to, I believe it's episode 7, to Reinventing Ed on the podcast, which also goes into excellent detail on distinguishing the expert, coach, and counselor roles that we can listen to for additional context as well.
I believe we did an updated version, which is episode 124, I believe.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to that. And is there anything in our conversation that we haven't targeted on yet that we wanted to speak about today? Or anything you wanted to leave our listeners with?
I don't think there's anything that we didn't address, but I guess just as a closing thought, I think if you're an educator who really cares, that's a very special thing. And I think it's a natural arc in the life of a teacher to have a strong start and at somewhere things drop off. And just as you rose and then had some kind of a drop off, I think the idea of renewal is possible. And you might not go back to the state you were in when you started your career, but I think there is, I hate to sound too cliche, but the phoenix arising from the ashes phase of our career that we can have. And we often don't hear about that. We hear about the jaded, frustrated, putting in their time phase of educators. And I don't think that that's a destiny. And what I really hope for this work and for this book, and the reason I'm so excited to talk with people like you, Joey, is just to spread these ideas, because I myself went through that. I went from feeling like I really was doing my dream job to being in a nightmare when I switched schools and found myself in a misaligned experience. And I was able to get out of it, not by any help from the system. So when I stopped caring, I realized there wasn't a role in the system to bring you back from that. So I talked to my head of school. They basically said, hey, do you want the paperwork to quit? Talk to the union. It was like, hey, do you want to leave? Talk to the wellness committee. It was like, well, here are some sleep tips and ways to ensure that you're doing well. And I realized that we're really missing this role in the school system to support educators who care, but hit this road bump at some point. And until we have those people, and until I get to be that person in a school system, I'm really hoping that this book and the work that we're doing serves to fill that void right now. And I hope helps educators who find themselves in that frustrated phase of their career to gain the clarification they need and the momentum that they need to move back to a place of feeling like they are contributing meaningfully.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Because my own personal conclusion is that when it comes to analyzing how disillusionment works within academia, it doesn't necessarily dissipate from a gradual state of improvement, but instead I found it to be just this ongoing cycle that really just oscillates back and forth from feat to helplessness throughout an academic's entire career as they start to build and grow into their own identities, one experience at a time.
Yeah. Well, you're at the risk now of having me go on like a 4-hour fireside chat with you about personal development alongside professional development. But yes, I'm fully with you on that.
We'll need to have a whole separate conversation just for that. I'll start with that
Please.
line and then we'll go from there again. That'll be on take 2. I'm so excited. Excellent. Well, Rob, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom and your calm, grounded approach to reimagining what's possible in education, because for our teachers and listeners who are navigating their classrooms and trying to build something meaningful, it's powerful to hear that there is a roadmap for change and that we don't have to focus on these obsolete and outdated systems in order to help each other make a difference. We'll link the Reinventing Education podcast in our show notes so our listeners can dive deeper. And until then, just keep making sure that you discover your role as you continue to build your own identity. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us on the Classroom Narratives Healing in Education podcast. If today's episode inspired you or made you think differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts and stay connected with us on the @Classroom Narratives podcast over Instagram and Facebook. Remember, together we can transform our scars into stars in education, one conversation at a time.